Hey guys, little different today. I'm in my house, but I still want to give you a good lecture on how to identify media bias because this is not an easy skill, and I think if I just shows you the PowerPoint, it still may not make sense, and then doing the homework assignments for this wouldn't make as much sense. So I want to do the best I can here. Hopefully, this will help you out. If you have any questions, please feel free to text me anytime. I'll get back with you as soon as I can. This is new to all of us, and I know we're trying the best that we all can. It's going to take a little time to get used to, okay? So again, please ask questions if you have them. I'm sure you're not the only one who has them. Okay, well, getting into this, the 6 types of media bias. There are 6, and we're going to talk about what bias is and everything. But first of all, I think we need to really understand what media is. Media is basically any outlet where you're receiving information, whether that be in a newspaper or a YouTube video, the news on TV, anything where you are receiving information, that is media. We have things like social media, like Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, all of those. Those are all different forms of media. Now, when we're talking about bias, it can be really any type of bias in the media, but the most significant one that you need to pay attention to is political. Because the news and these media outlets they want you to think the way that they do. And so they have these biases towards and against different things. And that's very, very heavily focused on political aspects. So on my PowerPoint over here, we see 2 different images from the same magazine. This magazine is Newsweek, and it's very obvious what biases they have. And their biases are mainly toward President Obama, very positive toward him, and very negative toward Mitt Romney. And we can see that definitely. If you look at Mitt Romney's, the title is The Wimp Factor. So basically they're calling Mitt Romney a wimp. And by doing that, they're trying to sway their readers into believing, hey, this guy might be a wimp. And then we look on the right side, we have President Obama there. He is looking very, very regal, very authoritative, very much in charge. And that's in contrast to Mitt Romney, who is smiling very goofily. It's not a bad picture of him, but you can see the message that they're trying to persuade just in their images alone. But also on Obama's side, you can see the title is called, Why Are Obama's Critics So Dumb? They're not calling Obama dumb. They're calling Obama's critics dumb. Critics are those people who criticize or who are criticizing him. So they're saying people who criticize Obama are dumb. And that's not a fair statement to make. Both of these things, the wimp factor and calling Obama's critics dumb, those are showing Newsweek's bias toward Obama and against Mitt Romney. Okay, but what is bias specifically? Bias is shown in these 2 images. We could talk about those, but I think it's very plain and simple. Bias, there are 6 different types. It is showing a negative or positive attitude unfairly and unjustly towards any group, person, or thing. Sorry, my cat just jumped on the table. I have 2 cats. You might see them. They're fine. We'll get over. Annie, what are you doing? There. You want to meet the class? This is Annie. Hi, Annie. She's giant. Anyway, go ahead. Go away. Anyway, back to bias. Go. There are 6 types. The first type that I want to talk about is bias by omission. Now we see a word within the word here, omission. It has the word omit. And if you know what omit means, it means to leave things out. So bias by omission is whenever media outlets leave stuff out. This type of bias is used when a media source purposely leaves out information which supports or favors one party or viewpoint. Annie, stop. So when a type of bias, or when a media outlet purposely leaves out information which supports or favors the other party, they're like, I don't want to support or favor another party, so I'm just going to leave that out. That way I can, stay true to my narrative, whatever I have, okay, or whatever the media outlet has. Bias by omission can occur within one particular story, or it can happen over a period of time in multiple stories given by the source. So say the same thing, same positive thing for another person, place, or thing is happening constantly, and one media source keeps leaving that out because they don't want to shed any good light on whatever that thing is. That's bias by omission. They're leaving it out. Each media outlet typically favors either the liberal or the conservative viewpoint, and they omit certain information accordingly. So if the liberals don't want to make the conservatives look good, they're going to leave out information that makes conservatives look good. Same thing the other way around. If conservatives don't want liberals to look good, they're going to leave out information that makes them look good. That's bias by omission. Right? Nobody likes being left out. The second type of bias is called bias by selection of sources. We have to know what sources are in order to understand this. Sources can be anywhere where you are provided information. It can be an expert in the field, so a scientist or whatever we're talking about, an economist. It could be just anybody who is an expert in their line of work, who is going to know information pertaining to whatever is being covered. That's a source. It could be that person. It could be a website. It could be statistics. Literally anywhere you're getting information, that is a source. So bias by selection of sources. This includes an uneven amount of sources that support one view over another view. So let's say I have 7 sources that paint a positive light on something, and only 3 sources that paint a negative light on something. That's pretty biased on the positive light, on the negative light, because there are more sources that cover the positive side than the negative side. And vice versa. It could work vice versa as well. So if a reporter, here's an example. If a reporter or journalist interviews 1 conservative and 4 liberals for the same story, this is an example of bias by selection of sources. If no experts are present, but the reporter uses phrases like experts say or evidence suggests in favor of one viewpoint, this is also bias. I'm sure you've heard that before on news media outlets. They say, experts say, blah, 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 or our evidence suggests. But if you don't know who those experts are, if you don't know where that evidence comes from, that's not very trustworthy. You shouldn't really trust that because you never know. They could be just making it up right there. You should always check to make sure that the experts are in fact experts in their field, or if the evidence is just coming from Wikipedia, that's not a good source, and you shouldn't hold that as valid and true. So that's selection of sources. The third type of bias, look for representation of both sides to find this bias. Because I'm an expert. The third type of bias is bias by story selection. When you have a media source that presents an unbalanced number of stories in favor of one party over another party, that's bias by story selection. I'm only going to publish 90% bad stuff about this party and only 10% good stuff about that party because I want to make that party look bad. That's story selection. Ignoring the good and only focusing on the bad. And that it works the other way around too. Let's say I want to make this other thing look really good, so I'm only going to publish good stories on it and not publish very many bad stories on it. That's story selection. This type of bias also occurs when a media source ignores one party's take on a particular issue and shows only one side of the argument. So where an argument is very one-sided, that's how you try to identify story selection. My cat is hunting. Annie, go away. Annie, go away. There's a robin outside my window. To identify this type of bias, one needs to be aware of both the left and the right perspectives. That way you can compare and contrast them to know if a media source is being biased or not. And I'll tell you right now, 99% of media outlets are biased, and it's very obvious that they are biased either towards or against something. It is our choices that show us what we truly are. This is Dumbledore. I love this gif. The fourth type of bias is bias by placement. The story placement is a measure of how important the editor considers a story. So if the editor thinks this is a really, really important story, where is it likely to go? Well, it's likely to go on the front page. It's likely to be at the top of the website. It's going to be big, bold. It's going to be catching your eye. It's going to be where it is placed that is important. Many people only read headlines, and therefore they only see the larger stories in the news. They ignore the lesser stories because they're not as big and bold, and they don't have giant headlines. So to identify placement, you look for where a newspaper places their political stories. What is being highlighted? What is the most eye-catching on the screen or on the page? You can identify the bias that way. Here's an example of that. I don't know if you can see this that well, but the very front story on this website, MSNBC, is watch FBI Director Comey testify on Trump wiretap claims. This looks normal so far. However, if you go into the top stories on the other side, the top stories are watch Bill Director Comey testified, Trump approval at record low. There's no evidence Obama wiretapped Trump. Watch somebody's view of Russia's election hacking. If you keep going on, though, you'll see that this whole website is very biased against President Trump. And that's typical of a lot of websites. They will only highlight what they believe. And that goes both ways. Both conservative websites and liberal websites do that. It's the way the media works. I think this is the fifth type of bias. This is bias by labeling. There are two forms of this type of bias. One involves using more extreme words to characterize one party over the other. For example, using liberal with one party and using ultra-conservative with the other. So we can see the bias there because liberal is just the normal term, and ultra-conservative is that extra, it gives a little oomph. This would be biased against conservatives because they're ultra-conservative, stuff like that. Another type involves the media referring to a source as an expert or using another favorable term without identifying the individual as liberal or conservative. So when you're given information from an expert, that expert is going to have their own stance, their own political stance. They're going to be either a liberal or a conservative. So their speech will be swayed by that. And if you don't know if they're a liberal or conservative, you as a viewer of that source, you're going to be swayed because of what they say, because they are an expert. But what if this expert is very, very liberal and they're trying to sway you into thinking liberally? Or what if they're very, very conservative and trying to sway you into thinking very, very conservatively? You have to think these experts are people too, and they have their own points of view. Okay, so labeling, they could be labeled an expert, but you don't know which way they lie. So two types of labeling. Calling people extra names or not calling them a name and letting their expertness sway you to one side or the other. When looking for this type of bias, remember labeling in and of itself is not bias. When one side is labeled and the other is not, that is bias. And we're going to see that in one of our assignments this week very clearly. See, that's the problem with our generation, your generation. You're obsessed with labels. Last type of bias is bias by spin. When one story features only one interpretation of a story, totally excluding the other, this is bias by spin. This can include suggestive or misleading photos, an obvious bias in the reporter or news source's tone, or anything else that misleads the story's audience. So what they're presenting, what this media is presenting, it might be true and accurate, but they might include photos with it that can turn the story and spin the story into the way they want the audience to view it. Okay? Just like we saw with the photos of Mitt Romney and President Obama, the photos themselves could sway an audience even without the titles. That's kind of bias by spin. They're just misleading the audience any way that they can. So if a reporter is reporting on the news, they might say something completely true. Peanut butter is made of peanuts. That's just a statement. That's a fact. But they also might say, peanut butter made of peanuts. Oh, this is Tonks. Hello, Tonks. Say hi to the viewers. Get out of the way. Yeah. So you could hear it in that tone. Peanut butter is made of peanuts. I'm saying the same thing, but since I said it in a negative tone, it made it seem like I don't like peanuts or peanut butter. Bias by spin. So to identify spin in the media, look for what perspective a news story matches. Are they matching the liberal perspective or the conservative perspective? And then you'll be able to identify that. Honestly, bias by spin is the most commonly used type of bias, if you're asking me. Bias by spin and bias by labeling. But all of them happen on a regular basis. Okay. This conversation is feeling very one-sided. Where do we get our information? Back in 1983, before I was born, before you were born, 90% of American media was owned by 50 different companies. That meant Americans were getting about 50 different viewpoints on the things that were happening in society, which is a pretty good number because you need to have all those viewpoints to see what people are thinking of. However, in 2011, those same companies were all bought and they're now owned by 6. So now instead of getting those 50 different viewpoints, we're only getting 6 different viewpoints. And that's not a lot. Okay, and then there is listed the different viewpoints that we are getting. It's interesting to see what companies are owned by who, and what those viewpoints are. You'd be surprised at some of them. So I encourage you to take a look at that and see where you're getting your information. Of course, this list is also outdated. So we could probably find a new one and notice that we're getting even less viewpoints from even 2011, which wasn't that long ago. Okay. What is a liberal? Well, what does liberal mean? Liberals hold political beliefs that a government exists to help as well as protect its people, often tolerant of different views and standards of behavior. Traditionally, the conservative viewpoint is the political belief that a government exists solely to protect the society as a whole, desire to preserve the status quo and maintain traditional values, customs, and avoid abrupt change. Of course, these are Google definitions. There's a little bit more give to that. It's not set in stone. This is what a liberal is. This is what a conservative is. But these are the general accepted definitions of these terms. Okay. All right. Your assignment for like tomorrow is identifying 12 different types of media bias. I've given you a little snippet of that. Little snippets to read and identify. There are 12 of them. The assignment is worth 12 points. I did give you a word bank to kind of help you place where these things go. This is a very hard assignment, so if you do have questions on them, please feel free to contact me. Really, you're not bugging me. This is my job. I want to help you. All right, with that said, I hope you guys do well. I hope you are staying safe, staying happy.